I am Tamara Leigh from Blackout Magazine, and we are here with the amazing Raquel Willis. And I am so excited to have you join us. And I have to say that it's kind of a little bit for selfish purposes because I don't get to talk to many other BIPOC LGBTQ women in publishing and media and communications. And so it's really exciting for me to just kind of be able to have a girlfriend conversation about the things that you've experienced and the things that you've learned. And of course, this amazing book that I've clearly been reading and taking all kinds of notes in. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Yes.
Go
No,
ahead.
well, I was gonna say no, that's real. I think there aren't enough queer and trans folks of color um in publishing, and we always need more of us translating what's happening in the world, telling our stories.
That's right.
But there are a lot of barriers, some of which I talk about in my memoir, The Risk It Takes to Bloom. But yeah, so
You
thank you.
do. Yeah, you do. And that was really interesting to me. Just sort of hearing about there were so many things in the book that really resonated with me because again, we travel in similar circles and kind of overlapping worlds and we do a lot of the same kind of work. I also was an activist and moved into journalism. It's what I went to school for as well. But there's a progression there, right? Like we all sort of like bloom into this work. And it was really interesting to read about your experiences with the magazine and um, that I don't know, balancing act between kind of feeling like you made it and how exciting that is, and feel like you're making people proud and feel like you're representing your community, but also stepping into these spaces and being at these tables that not many of us make it to, and how tough that experience can be. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, I'm used to being a bit of an outsider. I think a lot of queer and trans folks of color know what that feels like. I grew up in Augusta, Georgia. And as far as I knew, the queer community was me for a
Right,
long
right.
time. Like, that's what it felt like, just being isolated from other folks who were having similar experiences. And so I've carried what that felt like with me throughout my life. And so as I moved into college and met other queer and trans folks for the first time, I was very much aware that I was at a PWI, predominantly white institution at the University of Georgia. And so didn't have access to other Black, queer, and trans folks in particular. Um, uh, and so that was a thing. And then, of course, in media, working in media as a journalist, um, often feeling isolated or stifled or having all of the things that made me um, silenced or put
Mm,
aside or being told, oh, well, that's not important. But actually, no, my lived experience, this kind of prismatic way that I'm able to look at the world through the lens of race and gender and queerness is an expertise. And
absolutely.
it is just as important as anything I learned in journalism school. So now that I'm in a space in my career where I'm able to create more spaces and more experiences for other folks to tap into their power, I'm holding on to that, right? Because I want
Mm,
everyone in my orbit to know that they are seen in their totality.
that's amazing. But that's still a battle because that's clearly one of your ideals and that's amazing and it's so important, but I know that that concept is lost on a lot of other people that are in the power that have the power to make those decisions. So like what does that fight look like for you? Like is it just put on your blinders and push forward? Is it what is it?
No, I think we live in a slightly different context now, post 2020 at
Mm,
least, where
fair.
a lot of institutions have kind of had this cycle of, oh, anti-blackness is a thing, or oh, we don't really know what intersectionality looks like in action. We just kind of
Right.
know the words and the theories around it. And so I think right now we're in a unique position to call out some of those dynamics, right? But of course, not all of them, because I
Right.
think while there's been some strides there and maybe more people than ever before feel comfortable calling out those dynamics, we have other dynamics on the table now where folks feel immobilized to say anything. For
Mhm.
instance, it is a scarlet letter to talk about the Palestinian genocide for a lot of folks in so many industries, oh, including media. Um, and I think what we have to be able to do is understand that we have a responsibility to learn from those moments when we haven't been seen and be able to apply that feeling and those lessons to the experiences that other people on the margins are feeling as well. And I
Mhm.
think people have a hard time doing that across the board. It's not just the people with the most privilege who have a problem doing that, but it's people who have historically understood their oppression, dealing with the tension of maybe not being the center in a particular moment. And we have to be able to hold that even when we are not the center, and maybe especially when we are not the center, we have work to do.
That's right. That's right. So obviously, I'm not gonna say obviously. Obviously for me, sometimes that balance between being a journalism and being an activist, it's something very clear for me. Like I feel like my activism and my advocacy informs my journalism. I think that at its best, it always does. I think that any of our individual experiences have the opportunity to inform any of the work that we do, but certainly in journalism. But again, to speak to your point that you just made in terms of Palestine, a lot of times there is questions within a journalistic setting, within a media setting, about what that looks like in terms of balancing your personal activism and the things that you're passionate about and the things that matter to maybe not even your community, but a community that you can recognize is also suffering. How have you made sense of that for yourself, that balance? Because
I
it's hard.
It can be hard at points to know that balance, but I think if you have an understanding of these systems of oppression that are at play
Hmm.
and that how most of our industries are in bed with systems of oppression,
Right.
you start to build that muscle of seeing the injustice or
Hmm.
seeing the um lack of ethics or lack of morality or lack of values alignment in what a workplace or an industry may be calling you to do. So
Hmm.
when I think about journalism as an industry, it is biased. I think that it is dangerous for us to allow the lie to exist that industry and business is unbiased. It's not.
That's a great
And
point.
there has overwhelmingly been a lens of white supremacy, a lens of Western supremacy, a lens of the cis hetero patriarchy, and on and on.
Hmm.
Um, and when you become aware of that, I think it becomes almost impossible to not see when those dynamics are at play on issues that may seem further away from you.
Right.
So I'm very aware that journalism as an industry, at least in the mainstream sense, has really never fully had a place for me as a Black trans queer woman. And so I can understand when it doesn't have a place for instance, Palestinian voices, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or Jewish voices that are not invested in their trauma being weaponized against other groups on the margins. And I think we have to be continuously curious about what the deeper story is. And that's at the heart of storytelling and journalism, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. So like to get into the book a little bit, obviously we'll talk about the what's in the risk it takes to bloom. But for you, what is the risk it takes to bloom? What was the risk there?
The risk changes
Mm.
depending on the context, depending on the person. Um, it's there's really not one moment of risk that I talk about in the book and in my life story. There's different moments of risk. Um, the earliest moment of risk that I mentioned as kind of like this fully realized one was coming out as queer to my parents.
And you
And
come from a very religious background, right? I read that you came from a very religious family,
I
deeply
did.
embedded in the church.
A very Catholic family. You
Mm-hmm.
know, we sat in the front pew every Sunday, and my parents were very much invested in the work of the church, and my queerness was at odds with that,
Right.
of course. So it was a risk to potentially shatter my relationship with my family and with my parents, but I had to take the risk to see if, well, maybe there's something on the other side of all of these feelings of shame and powerlessness and silence. And yeah, it was difficult to do that, to walk through the fire there.
Yeah.
It was not immediately a full sense of relief, but in time,
Yeah.
my family grew and evolved alongside me. And so that laid the foundation for me to take risks at other points, whether it was taking the risk to perform in drag and
Mm.
figure out my relationship to gender, the risk then to own my womanhood. And then, of course, the multiple moments of risk I've taken in my career, whether it was to own social justice as a crucial part of my work as a
Mm-hmm.
journalist, which
Mm-hmm.
there is often a space of odds there,
Yeah.
and on and on. So the risk it takes to bloom is really a universal call to action around shredding up expectations to see if maybe there's something better on the
On
other
the
side.
other side. That's amazing. That's amazing. I actually loved your use of language through the whole book. I think that your language is so descriptive and beautiful and flowery. I think it speaks to the southern piece of you where, folks are just like there's just this beautiful use of language and that definitely travels all through the book, even into like the names of the chapters all seemed very purposeful and profound to me, just like the name of the book. And I love that because I don't know that people always think little pieces like that through and how much they can mean as a collective, as part of the whole, but also individually to both you and the readers. I thought that was amazing. So, congratulations to you on that. Like the one between visibility and vitality, like I thought that that was such a profound statement all in itself. And like what? lived in that space for you, that space between visibility and vitality?
Yeah, so I never sought out for visibility. Um, it just became a byproduct of being an outspoken trans person. And I think that that is still the dynamic because it is still revolutionary to share your transness with the world, right? It is
Yeah.
something that we have agency to share, just like our queerness.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think there's this idea that just being seen is enough,
Hmm.
and that's not true. You know, yeah, you could see the blackness of former President Barack Obama, but that doesn't mean that you fully regard or acknowledge or honor his life,
Mm-hmm.
which is why that whole dynamic of being post-racial in the United States
Right.
didn't really amount to much
Right. Right.
because visibility and representation is just one thing.
Mm.
It's not the full kind of course of what we need as human beings. And so when I think about the trans visibility era, yeah, you know, we've seen trans folks reach high levels in fashion and in television, maybe not quite yet in film, but perhaps we're on our way. Um, and even in some ways in publishing, but that doesn't mean that our humanity has fully been recognized. I think it's
Right.
a different thing when the world can elevate and honor the most exceptional versions of a marginalized experience. And so much of that is a shield of capitalism, of respectability, of all of these different things.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, we will have really made a mark when a Black trans person who doesn't have all of this pomp and circumstance that comes from exceptionalism can live their lives without fear and
Yeah.
live their lives with the fullness of housing and healthcare and education and employment. Oh, and of the pursuit of love and joy and pleasure.
Yeah. That's incredible. That's profound. And you're right. You're absolutely right. Like I think that we have fought as like a queer community in general for visibility so long that it's easy. It's funny, I had a conversation about marriage equality recently with someone and about how the fight ended for so many people at that point. Because that really wasn't our fight. That was, that was part of the community's fight, but there's still folks among us, primarily the BIPOC community, that are still fighting for basic rights, for housing, for safety, for food, to live. Um, and so in many ways, the journey just started there for so many of us, where there's a huge segment of our population where that was the peak. That was we did it, we got it, and now we can go back and live, these middle class lives and don't realize that that fight continues on for so many people, which is why I think some of us are in a strange sort of way blessed to still be involved and to still understand that there's still more so many more hills to climb and battles to win, and that are still in it, because visibility really is just the beginning.
It can be. It can just be the beginning. And being seen again is it's just not enough. I think there are a lot of queer and trans people who have been seen for our whole entire lives.
Mm,
And to be seen is not inherently a positive thing.
fair.
It also makes you a target, which is why we see this ramp up of anti-LGBTQ plus legislation across the United States. It's why we see these dismal trends of violence, of suicidality, and so much more, particularly in the trans community. Um, and so we have to do more. We have to do more than just see each other. We have to regard each other. We have to
Hmm.
see the connective tissue between our experiences. And and that is something that I'm always brushing up against as a storyteller and as an activist. It's not just that the work that I do centers on the Black trans experience, which it does, but it also hopefully elevates that the Black trans experience is connected to all of these other human experiences. And
Mm,
so when
mm-hmm.
cisgender people are told they can't like certain things or certain people or have certain experiences without betraying the gender that they and sex that they were assigned at birth, that is connected to what trans folks are facing.
Right. That is so interesting. So, another thing that I noticed in this book is that you really have had experiences in all parts of the country. Um, from the
Yes,
South,
I have, yeah.
from the South, worked on the West Coast.
Hmm.
I imagine you have to spend a lot of time on the East Coast doing the work that you do.
Yeah.
Um, and then so you've been in DC. I've seen you working in DC as well. So I th- it's been really an interesting experience for me being a New Yorker, a native New Yorker, and moving down. I live down south now. I live in Florida
Hmm.
now, and it really right it really gave me a change of perspective. Seeing the world living in a completely different place where politically is very, very juxtaposed to the directions that they're going. But it was important. I feel like it was important to my activism to be able to experience both of those things and have a better understanding of what life in both of those places looked like and felt like, what the work was, because it felt different in both of those places. In your experiences, which a lot of you touch in the book, in all of those different places, what have you noticed? What have you experienced being doing, because you've actually gotten the opportunity to do this, not only be in all those places, but like do this work in all of those different regions of the country. What have you experienced with that?
When I was young, I had this idea that my liberation required me to live somewhere other than the South. And I was bombarded with all of these messages of go to New York or
Hmm.
go to San Francisco. Those are where the queer people are. And that is a fallacy. Queer people are literally
Hmm.
everywhere. Everywhere. Now, what is different, sure, are these microcultures in different places.
Hmm.
Bigger metropolitans have tend to have more infrastructure. So you may find more established organizations and
Right.
um pockets of things like ballroom culture, or have more options around queer and trans owned restaurants
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
other spaces. But what I found is that no matter where you are, if you look hard enough, you will find the brilliance of queer and trans power.
Absolutely.
So even in those small towns where the only outlet for queer and trans people is a dive bar, where maybe they have a drag show and the queens are in, dollar store makeup, and the drag kings are, you know, wearing, some suit that they got from Goodwill.
Mm-hmm.
That is still queer and trans power.
That's right.
And actually, in some ways, it takes more effort and energy to express that power in that context than in some of these most elevated contexts.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Um, I thought it
And
was, oh,
the other thing,
mm,
it's also important for us to understand that the dynamics of homophobia and transphobia exist everywhere.
everywhere. Absolutely.
So there's this way that in the United States, the South and sometimes the Midwest are scapegoated as backwards or repressive in a similar way as communities of color
Mhm.
are uniquely painted as unwelcoming of queer and trans experiences. But we forget that those dynamics exist everywhere. And when I think about some of the strongest examples of queer and trans oppression, they come from a white evangelical context that is exported to other places, particularly around the globe.
Mm-hmm.
And we
Absolutely.
have to remember that.
And I almost think, not almost, I do. I believe it's also dangerous. Like that rhetoric is dangerous because, first of all, it paints one place in the country or certain places in the country as this utopia that still have so much work to do, and then vilifies other places where there's still so much beauty and still so much joy, even if it's, very rose that grew from concrete and you're fighting for that joy and that space in a little bit different way. This is an American problem. Transmedia, homophobia, anti-queerness, anti-blackness is an American problem. It's not a regional one. And I think it's so dangerous to assign that to a place as if that work doesn't need to be done
Right,
everywhere.
right.
Abs Absolutely. So I do remember a piece in the book where you're talking about the first time someone handed you a trans memoir to read and what that experience was like for you. What did you take from that memoir that you hope folks take from yours?
So the first trans memoir I read was My Story by Caroline Cozy, a model who eventually had her story of trans experience outed. What did I take from that experience? Um, from that memoir, but also the other narratives that I was consuming at that time, whether it was Black trans women like Monica Roberts,
Mm,
who founded and created the Trans Griot blog, the award-winning Trans Griot blog, and Janet Mock, who would eventually release two amazing memoirs, was that our stories matter as trans people, and that we deserve to share our own stories unfiltered, especially in a society that is constantly trying to ignore and erase us.
mm. And is that the same thing that you hope people get when you pick up yours? What do you want people to take away?
Yeah. I want people to take away that we have the power as individuals to chart our own destinies. define our own destinies. And we're all saddled with these too small boxes and stifling expectations that aren't liberating.
Mm,
And I start from a trans experience because that's mine, and a Black experience and my experience as a woman. But I think that that's a universal struggle. And so maybe we can have a little bit more grace for each other
mm,
in figuring out how to free ourselves up a bit.
absolutely. Um, so first of all, the book is everywhere. Um, and everything that I've heard people talk about the book has been super positive. Um, Literally, like I've heard people gush about it. What does that feel like?
It feels good to have people see themselves in the pages of Bloom, and it feels nice to have been able to share my story on this level.
Hmm.
I don't know that I will ever completely make sense of what that is or what that means.
Yeah,
Um, but it's an honor, and I just see myself as a bridge between the folks who are able to tell their stories on this level before, and the ones that are coming, because I know they're coming. Um, so that feels good, and I'm excited to tell more stories and continue this work.
so the first time I got to see you in real life doing your thing was at the we had the honor of covering the Creating Change conference, and you were the host for the whole week. And is that something you do a lot of? Like, or is that the kind of work that you enjoy doing? Like being able to be in front of an audience and interacting with the folks, and is that something you enjoy?
That's fun. Yeah, I enjoyed emceeing Creating Change. Most of my work though is media strategy.
Mm-hmm.
So I work with GLAD, and I work with iHeartMedia on Outspoken, their LGBTQ plus podcast network. And then of course I always have a slate of behind the scenes organizing efforts as well.
Of course.
So those things I would say are at the core of what fuels me. But I'll step out every now and then and, do a little razzle dazzle. And it was fun to be in that space again, because so much of my experience, at least professionally, has been in the nonprofit
Exactly.
space.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I think there are so many more stories that need to be told on that level. We don't think of nonprofit staff as workers. We have this idea that folks just come in off the street and then they're at an organization, but no, there's an industry there that has its own benefits and also shortcomings. And I think we need to share more. I was glad that I was able to tell my experience in nonprofit and corporate media spaces as candidly as possible.
Yeah, it was a unique opportunity to be around a huge collection of queer and trans folks that I don't know often have the opportunity to be in one room. It was almost overwhelming to me to be in that space, but it was also beautiful and interesting, and the people you meet and the things that you experience was really impactful for me. What did you take away from that conference and your experience there?
I took away that there are a lot of folks who are invested in the journey towards collective liberation for the long haul.
Mm,
Folks I hadn't seen in years, but that I trust, you're in your corner pushing. Um, And I think also that there's a lot of healing that still needs to happen in queer and trans community. I mean, we're not even talking about cultural dynamics. I'm just talking about in activism and organizing space.
Hmm.
There's a lot of historical harms around exclusion. And to an earlier point, the visibility piece has changed a lot of things. But just because you see one Black trans woman emceeing an event or a week of programming doesn't mean that all the progress to be made has been made.
Right. Yeah, that's real. That's real. Um, what do you think? How do we collectively work on that? Like, what do you think? Like, how do we collectively um help to change that?
We have to acknowledge organizing as work
Hmm.
that requires adequate compensation, living wages. Um, we have to acknowledge each other's humanity and our need for rest and a need or also acknowledge the way that this collective work it actually often extracts more from folks than the average kind of work experience.
Absolutely.
We need to be able to have humility and grace around what is institutional identity and what is individual identity. And we need to be able to work towards understanding critique
Hmm.
without like institutional critique without taking it personally.
Personally. Yeah, that's an excellent point.
Um and I think we all also just need to continue to find that balance between the issues that we think are close to our vest and the issues that are far off because we always have to figure out how to meet in the middle. That's where
Right.
the coalition building, the solidarity work happens,
Hmm.
that collective work happens is in the bridge between what is close to our heart and what feels farther away.
Who inspires you right now? Or what, for that matter? Who or what inspires you right now?
I'm constantly inspired by ancestors and transcestors like Marsha and Sylvia and Crystal LaBeija, Cecilia Gentili, who we just lost,
Mm.
um, Miss Major, a living legend, Sir Lady Java. These are folks who have demanded full lives as trans folks of color throughout time. And I know that there are many more out there that we don't know yet,
Right.
who also resisted in their own ways. And then I'm inspired, of course, by my peers. I just recently going to like the different series of homegoing services for Cecilia Gentili, got to see, a lot of particularly Black trans folks that, I hadn't seen in a minute. Some I hadn't even seen since before the pandemic,
Wow.
but that's what we do is we turn these tragic, traumatic moments into moments of celebration and communion. And so seeing them, and then of course the young folks coming up, the young queer and trans folks who are like, uh-uh,
Mm.
you might have did it this way, but this is the way we're doing it. Like, I love that. And they remind me to have humility for the next generations who may not look and live and love and navigate the world in the same way that I do.
That's amazing. Okay, so book, you have been honored by Essence. You have been honored by The Root. You have been honored by Glad. What's next? Like, what do you still aspire to? Like, obviously, the work, the community work, the advocacy work, the activism work goes on, obviously. But what is it that you still are striving for? What projects do you have coming up? What are you excited about?
um, well, a lot of things, most of which I can't even share because they're like top secret.
Right.
I'm excited to I'm excited to continue to tell more stories, particularly from the trans experience that are often unseen and unheard. I'm excited to I'm excited in the podcasting work I'm doing with iHeartMedia. Our
Mm,
first series, Afterlives, focuses on the life of Leigh Polanco, a
mm,
27-year-old Afro trans Latina who died in Rikers custody. So we were able to talk to family, friends, community that she inspired.
that's amazing.
Um, and then I have another podcast coming out in a few weeks called Queer Chronicles, which focuses on the experiences of queer and trans youth in red states across the United States. So that's also exciting. Um, I'm also working with some different collectives around how we can move a more gender move forth with a new vision of gender liberation, and I'm excited to share more about that soon-ish. But yeah, I mean that's what I'm excited about, and excited to continue to be in community. um yeah.
Okay, so first of all, I want to thank you so much for giving us your time today. We know how busy you are. I know you've been traveling all over the place recently with the book and all these projects and all the things that you're working on. So thank you. How can our audience follow your work? How do they know where you are, know where you're going to be next, know what projects you have coming up? How can they follow you?
The audience can follow me at Raquel Willis on all socials. Go to raquelwillis.com. You will find everything you need and hopefully more.
And then some. All right. Thank you so much for your time today.
Of course. Thank you.